have two polynomial fractions being multiplied together, everything you know about polynomials and fractions still applies. So factor whenever you can and simplify before multiplying. So for example, if you factor out the greatest common factor in the numerator of the first one, you'll notice that a 10 and an x both factor out. So 10x times x gives you 10x squared, and 10x times negative 2 gives you a negative 20x. In the denominator, we have a 40 in common, and we also have an x squared in common. So 40x squared times x gives you 40x cubed, and 40x squared times a negative 2 gives you the negative 80x squared. Similarly, for the numerator and denominator of the second fraction, 16 is in common, x squared, and so 16x squared times x gives you the 16x cubed, and 16x squared times 5 gives you the 80x squared. Similarly, for the denominator, 6 in common, and you'll need to multiply by x plus 5 in order to get the original back. And same thing with fractions. You want to always simplify before you multiply so that you can make the problem simpler before you make it more complicated. So if there are any common factors in the numerator and denominators, they'll cancel out. So for example, the x minus 2's in the numerator and denominator cancel out, and the x plus 5's. Okay, but the same thing goes for the numbers and the variables as well. So the 10 and the 40, the 10 cancels out with the 40, and the 40 will just become a 4. The same thing with the x's. So the x and the x squared will cancel out with one of the x's. Same thing with the 16 and the 6. If you divide both by 2, this becomes an 8, and this becomes a 3. And you can also cancel out across fractions as well, as long as it's something in the numerator canceling out something in the denominator. Okay, so for example, the x squared here and the x here also cancel out. So this x will cancel out with one of the x's here, and the 8 and the 4 divide both by 4, so this becomes a 1 and this becomes 2. So all we're left with in the numerators is 2 and an x, and all we're left with in the denominators is just a 3. Now let's talk about the excluded values, okay? Now, these really come from the fact that we can never have 0 in the denominator, or you can also think about it as we can never divide by 0. So any values that will cause us to have a 0 in the denominator at any point in time are not going to be values that are going to be allowed. So in order to figure these out, we look at each of these fractions in their factored form. Okay, so if you'll notice that in their factored form, the denominators are 40x squared times x minus 2, and 6 times x plus 5. Now, 40 is never going to be 0, but x squared might be 0 if x was 0. So x cannot equal 0, because then that would make 0, that would put 0 in the denominator. X can also not be 2, because if x was 2, then 2 minus 2 would give you a 0 in the denominator. Over in the second fraction, 6 will never be a 0, so we don't have to worry about that, but x plus 5 might be 0 if x was negative 5. So the values that x cannot be are 0, 2, and negative 5. Anything else is okay.